Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Dr. Joseph Knippenberg, professor of politics here at Oglethorpe. We're here to celebrate Constitution Day, which is actually September 17th, but we know better than to try to ask students to come to something on a Saturday. I'm not sure I would be here on a Saturday because I'd probably be at home glued to the television watching a football game. I understand that one of our presenters today will actually be making her way back from Atlanta to Fayetteville, Arkansas, where her Missouri State team will be playing the University of Arkansas. So Saturday's impossible. 235 years ago, on September 17th, delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia signed the document that created the Constitution. Since 2004, federal law has required that all publicly funded educational institutions undertaking programming, enlightening their students and faculty about the Constitution. Thanks to the generosity of the Jack Miller Center for Teaching America's Founding Principles and History, we here at Oglethorpe are able to do so in a grand way, one worthy of the importance of our governing document. The theme I asked our lecturers to address, constitutionalism and the Constitution between populism and cosmopolitanism, is, I think, both timely and timeless. Let me say a very few words about it before I invite our first speaker to the podium. First of all, its timeliness. Many have noted that in the US, and indeed across the developed world, there is a divide between the somewheres and the anywheres, a distinction coined by the British commentator David Goodhart. Our cosmopolitan elites are, needless to say, the anywheres, while our populist leaders and their followers affirm that a country is still a country. This difference is reflected in attitudes toward the Constitution, venerated on the one hand because it's ours, or perhaps sometimes found wanting in the light of more global or universalistic considerations. This difference can also play out in approaches to constitutional interpretation, as in how much the particular past, the so-called original meaning, and the universal present, a global sensus communis, if you will, should be given weight in applying the Constitution's provisions to the problems we face and the controversies we have. I'll offer one example and leave it to you to think of others. Does the Constitution's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishments apply only to those punishments that were considered cruel and unusual at the time of its adoption, or should we be guided by what people around the world think is appropriate today? Now let me turn to the timelessness of our topic. When I first studied political philosophy, it was not long after the drafting of the Constitution, I was introduced to the tension between the good and one's own, between loving something because it's inherently good and hence elicits my devotion, and loving it because it's mine. America's founding period offers us a very striking example of this pairing of universality and particularity. The Declaration of Independence, addressed to a candid world, ringingly affirms self-evident truths, not our truths, but truths that the whole world should recognize as such. But it does so on behalf of a people who claim to be entitled to their particular peoplehood on the basis of these truths. In turn, the Constitution is an expression of the will of the people, of that people. Is it good because it is the application of universal principles to our particular situation, or is it good because it's ours? I could go on, but you're here to hear what others have to say, as am I. I'll close with a quotation from one of the most profound students of our founding era, Abraham Lincoln. In his 1837 address on the perpetuation of our political institutions, responding to the deep divisions and political strife in our still young republic, Lincoln said this: "The answer is simple. Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity swear by the blood of the Revolution never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country, and never to tolerate their violation by others. As the patriots of '76 did to support the Declaration of Independence, so to the support of the Constitution and laws, let every American pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor. Let every man to remember that to violate the law is to trample on the blood of his father, and to tear the character of his own and his children's liberty. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in the courts of justice. In short, let it become the political religion of our nation, and let the old and young, the rich and poor, the grave and gay, of all sexes and tongues, and colors and conditions, sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars. I can think of no more fitting injunction embodies the tension between the particular and the universal than this as we commemorate our Constitution and consider the theme we have before us today. Without further ado, I want to welcome to the podium, not the pulpit, but the podium, Professor Benjamin Gross of Jacksonville State University. I would say a few words about him. He's an assistant professor of political science at Jacksonville State in Alabama, where he teaches courses in political theory, American government, methodology, and international relations. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of North Texas, where he also served as the lead editorial assistant to the American Political Science Review. And anyone who has a Ph.D. in political science knows that that is our discipline's preeminent journal. His recent publication examines Rousseau's thoughts with regard to disease and disasters. In addition, he's the director of the Tocqueville Lecture Series at Jacksonville State and editor of Compass, an undergraduate journal in political science. And he invites anyone who is interested in publishing works in political science or politics as an undergraduate to consult with him. And I can certainly pass along his contact info to you. He's a native of Chicago and got his bachelor and master's degrees from Northern Illinois University, which is in a city that people in Illinois mispronounce as DeKalb. We all know it's DeKalb, not DeKalb. Outside his professional responsibilities, you'll find him volunteering with Scouts, using his mathematics minor to count his daughter's cheer out routine, keeping up his music skills by singing Simpson songs to his infant, and let's see, what else does it say here? Enjoying the romantic ideal of family life while also trying to squeeze in a Cubs game here or there. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Benjamin Gross.
I think, there we go. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Nittenberg. And thank you, Oglethorpe University, for hosting me, and thank you, the Jack Miller Center, for putting this on. Having Lincoln read before I come out made me feel very much at home. Often, right, Lincoln is known as an aggressor sometimes down here, so hearing some Lincoln before coming up put me back into Illinois. Now, as the opener, I know what my job is. I'm supposed to come up here, fill up 30 minutes of time, maybe have one good song, 4 minutes of something worthwhile. And so when the audience shows up later to hear the headliners, you guys can say, hey, yeah, there was some opening act and they had a decent jam, maybe you want to check them out. I think I can achieve this goal. My lecture is going to argue 3 main points. First, I will demonstrate that America is a regime based on modern political philosophy, not classical political philosophy. Second, I introduce the 3 waves of modernity as developed by Leo Strauss to determine that America and its founding documents are based on the ideas of the first wave of the modern project. Finally, using these components, I argue that the somewheres and anywheres are second-wave moderns that are embracing the ideas that confront the crisis of the West. I argue, however, there is an option that we can also use to confront this crisis, and that is the everywheres, those that embrace the first wave of modernity. While the everywheres who embrace the ideas of the Declaration and the Constitution are a potential path, they must also confront the crisis of the West, and without a thoughtful and coherent response, it is likely that the people will reject the everywheres as they search for a meaningful solution to the radical historicism of the third wave. While I'm not the first to argue that America is a modern regime, this argument is not universally accepted. Indeed, there are those that contend that America is connected to antiquity because the framers combined classical prudence with biblical morality. As I understand these scholars, America is an ancient regime because the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution embrace the classical doctrine of natural right. Natural right argues that there is a single and unchangeable principle of justice, although the application of it is dependent upon circumstance. This is why prudence takes a center stage with regards to natural right, and why some argue that prudence and natural right are one and the same. These scholars are the ones claiming that America is an ancient regime, and argue that the Declaration and the Constitution are the creation of a rational dialogue that embraces natural right, which was reinforced by statesmen in America's history, such as Abraham Lincoln. By contrast, when I speak of modernity, I mean a line of thought that argues there are still universal truths about human nature, but justice is no longer a single and unchangeable principle. In modern thought, the truths about human nature are far lower, but perhaps more stable. For moderns, human nature is found in our initial condition, as compared to the ancients that found the truth of human nature in a final purpose that we must strive to achieve. Although the argument that America is an ancient regime is not shared by all, it is one that has significant backing in the contemporary moment. It no longer makes sense to talk about this with directionality. Texas is not the East Coast and Michigan is not the West Coast. But I also want to avoid making this feel like a Harry Potter book, where we must use phrases like "he who must not be named." Although perhaps if I had titled this lecture something like "The Founding Fathers and the Order of the Everywheres," Dr. Nippenberg would have had an easier time attracting students to attend on a Friday afternoon. At last, Bloomberry will not be blasting my inbox for any publication or book deals soon, I think. To return to the topic, however, I will give you one such example, a personal example. My father, a few weeks ago, sent me a message on Facebook. An ad for a course had appeared in his feed, American Citizenship and Its Decline, from Hillsdale College. He was intrigued, but he had a gut feeling. In his words, "This is interesting, but I cannot pick up the slant." He loves his country. He wants to be knowledgeable about the United States. He cares about civic duty. I can prove this to you. He's an Eagle Scout. He's still deeply involved in Scouts. In fact, he's the vice president of district operations, an unpaid position that volunteers numerous hours away from the household to still help the organization. And he's involved in numerous areas as a volunteer with his city government. Here's a man who Tocqueville would recognize as being an active small d Democrat. My father has a college education. He teaches the merit badge on citizenship in the nation, and he's involved in local politics. All this preparation only gave him the ability to know that the free course from Hillsdale was offering him something of value, something worthwhile, but it also had his perspective that he could not understand on his own. So he sought out his son with a Ph.D. in political theory for help. Finally, I had something to offer to my family. This is what prompted us to turn away from Facebook Messenger and start a real conversation. Through our discussion, we came to the ideas of comparing classical and modern thought and how this course could be very helpful. Indeed, it's a very beautiful class, right? The fair, the noble, the beautiful, these are attractive things. And if the arguments can improve the health of citizens through developing enlightened reasoning and liberated thinking while calming their passions and orienting their desires to be followed by reason instead, this would be a great service. This is why, however, the argument that America is a modern regime needs to be re-examined. Lacking the financial support and the attractive qualities of the other argument, this idea rests on the ability to use reason to demonstrate itself. I argue that we can demonstrate America as a modern regime through 4 different concepts. By no means are these concepts exhaustive. I think, however, they provide overwhelming evidence that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are rooted in ideas of modernity rather than antiquity. These 4 areas I present to you are virtue, institutions and chance, happiness, and religion. The guiding question for ancient political philosophy is the question of the best political order. This makes virtue a central part of the study of political science and classical political philosophy. For if the best political order exists, then this best political order must have moral principles that are necessary. Leo Strauss, a serious student of classical political philosophy, argued in his 1965 course, quote, "So in other words, the city is for the sake of moral virtue, but moral virtue is itself also for the sake of something higher, philosophy. Moral virtue is ultimately, from the philosopher's point of view, a reflection of philosophy," end quote. Political life, the city, is for the sake of moral virtue. But what moral virtues exist as habituation, and what moral virtues exist because they develop the best human or humans, and possibly the best political order, is a question to be examined. This is the introduction to political philosophy, a beginning point. Thus, through practicing their art, the political philosopher can be like a doctor. They can investigate the body politic to determine the healthy elements and what portions require treatment to be directed to the best moral virtues. In this way, moral virtue is not a good in and of itself, according to classical political philosophy, something that Plato wrestles with in Book 1 of the Republic. By comparison, modern political philosophy rejects that the best regime is the political community that is most conducive to the practice of virtue. Instead, modernity argues we must accept human beings as they are, not as they ought to be. Morality, virtue, and ethics can only exist once political life has been artificially constructed. There is no justice in nature. Thus, in our natural state, virtue does not exist. This transformation changes virtue into something that's for the sake of the Commonwealth. If virtue supports the continuation of the regime based off of our initial nature, then it is appropriate. There are no higher standards to judge the civic and moral virtue against. Comparing these two conceptions of virtues demonstrates one of the most profound disagreements between ancient and modern political philosophy. Ancient political philosophy argues that political life is the subject of morality, as virtue is for the sake of which the regime exists. Through examining what is virtue, the life of philosophy becomes possible, which also suggests that philosophy can improve our knowledge of virtue in political life, although this knowledge may not be very practicable. Modern political philosophy argues political life is not the subject of morality, as virtue is the mechanism to maintain the regime upon its construction. Through doing what is necessary, philosophy becomes actionable and can produce stable political life by accepting the initial human nature as the final human nature. Given that this is a major disagreement between the ancients and moderns, it seems an appropriate way to judge America's founding. Let's turn first to the Federalist Papers. These op-eds were published to explain the thought of the Constitution in hopes of persuading Americans to support the ratification of the new government. In Federalist number 6, Hamilton writes, quote, "Have we not already seen enough of the fallacy and extravagance of those idle theories which have amused us with promises of an exemption from the imperfections, weaknesses, and evils incident to society in every shape? Is it not time to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as the other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue?" This passage reads like chapter 15 of The Prince from Machiavelli. In that chapter, he moves the reader away from the, quote, "imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in truth," and moves us towards, quote, "the effectual truth of the thing," end quote. Like the Florentine, Hamilton argues that we have seen enough of idle theories of political life. What is needed is to awaken from an ideal of political life to accept the practical principles that can direct our government. In what appears to be an agreement with Machiavelli, a modern, Hamilton argues the world is as remote from wisdom and virtue, the guiding topics of ancient political philosophy, as it ever was. The world has lacked progress. Thus, a change from these idle theories, a change from ancient political philosophy to practical maxims of modern political philosophy is necessary. While this passage from the Federalist Papers suggests the defense of the Constitution rests on modern ideas rather than ancient, it is yet to demonstrate clearly that the place of virtue does not exist in American political thought. If we return to the records of the Federal Convention of 1787, however, we find evidence that the founders were moderns in their understanding of virtue itself. On June 16th, the convention was debating why a national government was necessary, as John Lanson of New York and others were arguing against the new ideas of this new Constitution. In response to those who wanted to maintain the ideas of the Articles of Confederation, James Wilson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a future Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, and a delegate from Pennsylvania at the convention, argued the need for the document. According to James Madison's notes, Mr. Wilson said, quote, "Despotism comes on mankind in different shapes, sometimes in an executive, sometimes in a military one. Is there no danger of a legislative despotism? Theory and practice both proclaim it. If the legislative authority be not restrained, there can be neither liberty nor stability. It can only be restrained by dividing it within itself into distinct and independent branches. In a single house, there is no check but the inadequate one of the virtue and good sense of those who compose it," end quote. Both ancient and modern political philosophy aim to avoid despotism. The way to prevent this in classical political philosophy is through the development of virtue, as morality is anti-tyrannical. Note, however, Wilson, one of the main architects of the Constitution, does not argue for virtue as a check on legislative despotism. Virtue and good sense, common sense, the originating point of classical political philosophy, are inadequate defenses against despotism. Wilson is not alone in this assessment, as others of the convention, such as Benjamin Franklin, argued virtue would not exist within government. Instead, Wilson and these founders argue that to achieve the goals of stability and liberty, institutions must be constructed. While this jumps ahead to my next point, this evidence provides key insights that the architects and defenders of the founding documents of the United States did not subscribe to the ideas of virtue as they exist in classical political philosophy. Mr. Wilson's remarks also transition us to the second and also profound test to evaluate if the founding of America is based on ancient or modern ideas. Since the best political regime depends on virtue for existence, the chance of it coming into reality is less than Kent State defeating Georgia next week. Modern political philosophy is dedicated to the removal or reduction of chance from political societies. Through embracing modern science, modern political philosophy can discover and implement institutions that can guarantee the solution for political problems that will allow humans to live in a peaceful and comfortable world. When we examine the notes on the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist Papers, there is a plethora of evidence to support this idea. The founders embraced institutions that will overcome chance to produce good government. There are numerous examples from Edmund Randolph, George Mason, Rufus Keene, Charles Pinckney, and more that demonstrate this point. These examples demonstrate that multiple founders recognized the need for institutions that could overcome chance if a new government was to be successful. Perhaps, however, the clearest example at the convention is something that is later elaborated within the Federalist Papers themselves. When discussing how to improve the quality of representation, Mr. Wilson notes that institutions are the solution to human nature. Quote, "There is no danger of improper elections if made by large districts. Bad elections proceed from the smallness of the district, which gives an opportunity to bad men to intrigue themselves into office," end quote. James Madison further elaborates this idea on June 6, 1787. Quote, "In a Republican government, the majority, if united, have always an opportunity. The only remedy is to enlarge the sphere and thereby divide the community into so great a number of interested parties that in the first place, a majority will not be likely at the same moment to have a common interest separate from that of the whole or of the minority. And in the second place, in the case they should have such an interest, they may not be apt to unite in that pursuit. It was incumbent on us then to try this remedy, and with the view to frame a republican system on such a scale and in such a form as will control all the evils which have ever been experienced," end quote. This is the institutional solution that is later explained on November 22nd, 1787, when Federalist Number 10 is published. The argument that institutions, not virtue, will allow government to overcome chance in order to produce stability and a good life flowed throughout the Federalist Papers. If more evidence is needed, a discussion of Federalist 51 should suffice to show that the founders argue institutions, not virtue, not angels, will produce good government. Thus, I think we see overwhelming evidence that both at the Constitutional Convention and in defense of the Constitution, there is a rejection of the ancient concept of virtue in favor of an acceptance of the modern argument for developing institutions that regard humans as they are to overcome chance. It appears, therefore, that the founding of the United States embraces two, if not the two, principles of modernity. I, however, promised that I would demonstrate America as a modern regime by investigating 4 areas. So let me quickly provide the evidence from the 2 remaining ones. Happiness is a central question in the history of political philosophy. As Socrates offers, quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living for a human being," often, end quote. Often that last part, "for a human being," is forgotten when it is quoted, but that is an important part to put into that quote, or remember in that quote. If we are to live a human life, we must examine humanity. This means we must examine what is happiness. The idea is radical in antiquity because the city already provides an answer to what is happiness. When Aristotle presents the 3 competing ideas of political life of Sparta, Crete, and Carthage in the politics, each of these regimes has a conception of happiness that it aims to. In the United States, there is no such notion of shared happiness. Indeed, Americans seek happiness. A quick Google search for happiness often brings despair, as we are overwhelmed by the differing answers from psychologists, neurologists, self-help gurus, self-proclaimed philosophers, influencers, bloggers, YouTubers, and more. This diversity of thought, however, embraces the American promise. The Declaration of Independence claims our inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Note, while the American regime allows us to pursue happiness, the regime itself does not tell us what happiness is. This appears to me to be connected with the elimination of the ancient understanding of virtue from the regime. By lacking a shared idea of virtue, we also lack a shared understanding of happiness. While liberality may make one individual happy, it may make another individual miserable. Thus, the United States cannot embrace one idea of happiness as being the correct understanding, as this was done in ancient regimes. This shift from a shared understanding of happiness to the recognition of a pursuit of happiness for each individual is another piece of evidence that America embraces modern political thought. Lastly, the place of religion in the Constitutional Convention and the Constitution itself suggests America cannot be an ancient regime. The ancient polis and empires had a shared deity. This deity is important in producing a common understanding of the best way of life. Remember, one of the charges against Socrates was that he did not believe in the gods in whom the city believes. America, however, lacks any such common understanding of religion. For example, on June 28, 1787, with the convention about to collapse, Benjamin Franklin calls for the delegates to pray for heavenly assistance with their deliberations. While this motion is seconded, it did not receive a vote. Alexander Hamilton and others expressed apprehension over the call for prayer. Even with Randolph's revised call for prayers to begin after July 4th, there was no vote. Eventually, the convention motioned for adjournment without ever taking a vote on these calls. And that wasn't easy. They wrestled and they had to keep doing parliamentary procedures and trying different things. If America had a common understanding of religion like the ancients, there should have been no need for this politicking. There should have been no need for this parliamentary behavior. That the convention avoided voting and continued to not pray is evidence of a lack of a shared deity. The lack of a shared deity is also carried into the Constitution itself. While many will focus on the First Amendment, the original document also expresses a commitment to the toleration of faiths. Article 6 explicitly states, quote, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States," end quote. Instead of instituting a state religion, the United States embraces the Lockean resolution to faith. By tolerating all faiths that are not, quote, contrary to human society or to those moral rules which are necessary for the preservation of civil society, end quote, the United States embraces Locke's letter of toleration, allowing for a plethora of faiths to coexist within its regime. This form of toleration differs even from those of the Antiquity era, such as the Roman Republic. Thus, the relationship between religion and the political regime in the United States is again evidence that the government is rooted in modern, not ancient thought. Having provided evidence that America is rooted in modern thought, I now turn to give an understanding of what modernity is and how the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution fit within modernity. It helps to know that I agree with the formulation developed by Leo Strauss, that there are three major waves of modernity. For the sake of this lecture, I will focus on one political philosopher within each wave to provide an example of view. But realize these are not monoliths, that these can have disagreements within each wave. If you listen to music, you may have heard of ska music. There are waves of ska music. Not every band within a wave is the same band. There are disagreements, but there are general themes that put them together. The first wave of modernity is characterized by the idea that the natural world does not provide humans with some end or telos to orient our lives. There is no final cause, to use the language of Aristotle. Instead, we have to look at the initial condition of nature to understand what is natural. Upon understanding nature as it is instead of as we want it to be, humans are free to use their reason and technology to augment nature to secure and expand our initial nature. Thus, the first wave of modernity argues that human nature exists, that this nature is true everywhere and always, but it lacks a final or higher purpose to direct it. In this way, human nature is akin to the nature of gravity. Gravity is a natural phenomenon. A law of gravity exists that explains the nature of this phenomenon. This law, however, only explains the efficient and material causes of gravity. The purpose of gravity is not part of the study. Gravity exists because it does. there is no higher purpose for the existence of this natural phenomenon. For the first wave of modernity, human nature is like this phenomenon. It exists within nature. There are efficient material causes that exist. Upon discovering these, we can produce a coherent science of humanity. But this science will not include a higher purpose for that nature. The thought of John Locke embraces the first wave of modernity. In an essay concerning human understanding, Locke argues that a human is a corporeal being that has reason. He opens the door to the possibility that one day, perhaps primates could also be defined human this way. Or as my advisor liked to say, if an alien was to appear on Earth and it was a physical being that had reason, welcome to humanity. The truth of human nature is within our initial nature then. We are to use our reason to achieve comfortable self-preservation and as much pleasure as possible, although how this pleasure should be directed and what is correctly pleasure is something we need to investigate. Upon defending an understanding of humanity, Locke is able to argue for a coherent system of government founded on the universal principles that all humans are endowed with life, liberty, and estate, and potentially health. These facts of human nature are true everywhere and always because they are the innate nature of a human. Locke's arguments regarding human nature accepts humans as they are instead of how they ought to be. Or in the famous words of the great philosopher Keshe, we are who we are. The second wave of modernity is characterized by a radical shift in the understanding of history and freedom. Rousseau agrees that there are fundamental truths concerning human nature. These truths, however, are more minimal and quieter than those argued by the first wave. The Citizen of Geneva proposes that there are only two, or perhaps three principles to human nature. Quote, setting aside, therefore, all scientific books that teach us only to see men as they have made themselves, and meditating on the first and simplest operations of the human soul, I believe I perceive in it two principles preceding reason, one of which interests us ardently in our well-being and in our self-preservation, the other which inspires in us a natural repugnance to seeing any sensitive being, and principally our fellow humans, perish or suffer, end quote. The argument of the second wave of modernity is that a natural human is a pre-rational being. It is a being that desires for its self-preservation and to avoid the natural repugnance of suffering. While self-suffering is what is to be most avoided, a human can extend their being into another sentient object. Hence, when a human sees another human or even an animal suffering, the extension of the self allows the human to feel this sentient being's pain. It is human nature to desire to avoid this feeling of suffering. While this appears to be only two principles of human nature, a third one does appear to exist there, well-being. Humans want not only self-preservation, but more. Humans are able to extend their desire for self-preservation beyond this low and solid desire because they have freedom or perfectibility. Whereas corn will always remain corn, or a cow will always remain a cow, humans are able to evolve, develop, educate themselves in a way that is not due to accident alone. Humans can produce their own ideal of perfection. Again, to quote Rousseau's second discourse, quote, I see in every animal only an ingenious machine to which nature has given sense to itself and to protect itself up to a certain point from everything that tends to destroy or disturb it. I perceive precisely the same thing in the human machine with this difference, that nature alone does everything in the operation of the beast, whereas man contributes to his own operation in his capacity as a free agent, end quote. This is why the second wave of modernity must break from the first wave. First wave moderns understand human nature as a fixed law, that is a scientific problem which our reason, technology, and art can resolve. Rousseau and those following him argue that reason, technology, and art are all foreign attributes to humans. Humans develop these through the process of history as faculties to achieve our own ideals of perfection. Like the ancients, perfectibility is now possible in the second wave. Like the moderns, however, there is no telos. Perfection cannot be found to have a natural standard that is true everywhere and always. Instead, perfection is particular. Humans are not attempting to achieve one idea of humanity within the second wave. Instead, there are many possible ideals, and humans are malleable to these multiple goals, which means the education of nature, the education of things, and the education of man can put a human on a historical path towards achieving numerous ideals of perfection instead of just one. The third wave of modernity accepts the historical nature of humans as developed by its predecessor. This wave, however, is like the third wave of ska. It is more aggressive, it is darker, and it is louder. Whereas the second wave of modernity argued that the sentiment of existence experiences its height with fullness, harmony, and love, the third wave of modernity argues that the sentiment of existence is dominated by terror, anguish, and tragedy. The third wave argues that humans are not progressing towards some ideal of perfection or some rational end of history. Instead, human historical development is accidental in nature. Thus, we are tragic beings. The ideals of perfection offered to humans have come from three sources according to this wave. These sources are nature, God, and reason. The first wave of modernity destroyed both nature and God as sources for human perfection in favor of reason. Rousseau in the second wave of modernity, however, provides arguments that reason is not natural to human being. If correct, this means reason is the result of a creative act of freedom. Hence, the third wave argues, quote, all ideals are the outcomes of human creative acts, of free human projects that form the horizon with which specific cultures were possible. They do not order themselves into a system, and there is no possibility of a genuine synthesis of them, end quote, from Leo Strauss's lecture on the three waves of modernity. Since all ideals are the creation of humans, no one ideal is superior to another. Indeed, 1,000 tablets have been put ahead of us, on us, before us. Since reason is just a historical development, there is no expectation to assume that a rational end of history exists within nature. The third wave of the modernity questions the entire modern project. This is why Nietzsche, perhaps the most important philosopher of the third wave, attempts to find a way forward for human nature that transcends humanity. By arguing that all human creation leads to the same endpoint, Nietzsche comes to the conclusion that humanity must either transcend its current form of creativity, to form a type of art that is beyond human, which is the self-conscious evolution of the species towards a willpower that is beyond all previous creative acts, or to become trapped in the historical moment, which will result in a dead end of evolutionary development of humans that will become herd-like beings that prefer comfort and self-preservation to any form of nobility, greatness, or creativity. Having examined these three waves of modernity and demonstrating earlier that America is a modern, not ancient regime, it seems clear to me that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution embrace the first wave of modernity. The best piece of evidence for this conclusion is the rejection of historicism. That exists within the Declaration of Independence, as historicism is the foundation for both the second and third wave. The Declaration declares principles that are universal, not historical. While we often jump to the second paragraph of this document, the first paragraph clearly indicates that America is built on an understanding of, quote, laws of nature and of nature's God, end quote. The self-evident truths of human equality and the unalienable rights are not the product of human history and human perfectibility. Instead, these are ideas that are within our nature. Other ideas within the Declaration support the conclusion that this document rests on the first wave of modernity. This includes the use of consent between equals to form an artificial government, the theory of revolution, and the purpose of government. These ideas resonate with the first wave of political philosophy, especially John Locke. The ideas of the first wave of modernity continued into American government from the Declaration into the Constitutional Convention. For example, Mr. Pinckney argued that the Constitution did not need to worry about balancing different interests to rule, such as the interests of the rich that were in the United Kingdom, as the current situation of America allows for the ideas of the first wave of modernity to prosper. Quote, the vast extent of unpeopled territory which opens to the frugal and industrious a sure road to competency and independence will effectually prevent for a considerable time the increase of the poor or discontented, and by the means of preserving that equality of conditions which distinguishes us from them, end quote. This passage echoes Locke's teaching that, quote, God gave the world to men in common. He gave it to the use of the industrious and rational, end quote. The use of human reason allows us to extract from uncultivated nature a wealth that will support our natural independence and equality as human beings in the United States. Thus, Locke's ideas and the first wave of modernity were influential in both the Declaration and the Convention. This evidence shows us that government produced through these documents is one that embraces the first wave of modern thought. This brings us then to the contemporary problem observed by David Goodhart. He sees the world being divided between the somewheres and the anywheres. If I understand him correctly, the somewheres are those who identify or whose identity is tied to a place of origin. They tend to populism and nationalism as a way to preserve this identity. By comparison, the anywheres are those whose identity is tied to experience. They tend to embrace institutionalism and cosmopolitanism to preserve this identity. It seems to me that both of these identities are tied to the second wave of modernity. The somewheres are tied to to an ideal of human perfection, one idea of human perfection. This ideal resembles Rousseau's conception of political life and civil right as being means to achieve harmony. The somewheres desire a homogeneous political community that has a shared history, culture, language, and values, as this produces the necessary harmony within political society to experience happiness. While the somewheres are drawn to this romantic ideal of political life, they are misled if they think it can be achieved within a large nation-state. Indeed, Rousseau suggests that fanaticism might be able to direct us away from destructive paths and towards the sublimation of virtues, but he also warns that this path is far more likely to end poorly than not. Thus, while the somewheres are drawn to an ideal of perfection, this political harmony is unlikely to happen in the contemporary setting. The anywheres are also an expression of the second wave of historicism. Instead of embracing ideals of perfection as expressed by Rousseau, these individuals share visions fitting of Kant's perpetual peace or other German idealists that see international harmony as possible. Indeed, in Perpetual Peace, Kant writes, quote, "Our concern here is not with philanthropy, but with right, and in this context, hospitality, which means the right of an alien not to be treated as an enemy upon his arrival in another's country. He may request the right to be a permanent visitor, but the right to visit, to associate, belongs to all men by virtue of their common ownership of the earth's surface," end quote. This romantic vision of a cosmopolitan world conforms to a different ideal of human perfection. Instead of numerous political communities forming where each community is left to produce its own standard of civil right that replaces natural law, that is the somewhere solution, the anywheres see a rational end of history that will bring all humanity to the same endpoint. This, however, is not due to the nature of humans. Instead, it is due to the historical progress of humanity. Goodhart is likely correct in seeing that the somewheres and anywheres exist, but presenting the world in this dichotomy accepts that either the second wave of modernity is correct, or the second wave of modernity is the only wave of modernity that can confront the challenge of the West. As I have suggested, we can break out of this mode if we think the first wave of modernity offers a valid counter-argument. I call this counter-argument the everywheres. The everywheres are dedicated to the proposition of a universal understanding of human nature that is not dependent on history. In this way, the everywheres look a bit like the anywheres. Both groups see a universal truth that all humans can share in. The everywheres, however, think the universal truth exists within human nature, not human history. In this way, the everywheres are not anywheres. This is why communism, a part of the second wave of modernity, and liberal democracy have similarities. Both governments agree that the universal prosperous society of free and equal men and women is the end of political life, but they disagree regarding the means to achieve it. The universal history of communism justifies the ideology to use whatever means necessary to achieve this rational end of history. The universal principles of liberal democracy limits the political philosophy to means that conform to these principles to achieve its universal ideas. While the everywheres and anywheres agree on the universality of the goal, they differ greatly on the means on how to achieve the goal. The difference is due to the everywheres finding universality in the nature of humans, whereas the anywheres dedicate themselves to the universality in the history of humans. While the everywheres are dedicated to the universal understanding of humanity, they also understand that each society must use its own reason to find, put forth, and continue this understanding of human nature. Thus, the everywheres accept that there are particulars or particularities to to each society, to each state, which will make them different from each other. In this way, the everywheres look like the somewheres, as they agree that the application of universal law can take on different forms given the context and environment a people find themselves in. Note, however, the everywheres are not ancients because this universal law of human nature no longer includes justice. Yet, the everywheres differ from the somewheres because the somewheres are not dedicated to any universal end. Yes, the everywheres think that different political regimes will exist because different means are necessary to achieve the same outcome given the different conditions that humans find themselves in. Thus, these differences are not arbitrary. These differences are necessary to achieve the uniformity of human nature. The differences of political regimes for the somewhere is arbitrary to a degree. Since civil right has replaced natural law, any coherent political regime that produces wholeness throughout the citizenry is rational and an acceptable outcome. The most likely outcome of the somewheres is not only that the political regimes are different in means of achieving their purposes, but that the purposes of each political regime differs. This is what makes each community unique and a somewhere. It seems to me then that if we think the paths of the somewheres and the anywheres produces a political life that is undesirable, unattainable, or unlikely, then the paths of the everywheres that embrace universal truths of the Declaration of Independence, while also allowing for the particular means of the Constitution to achieve these truths, is a more prudent and sound political project. Perhaps, however, the somewheres and anywheres are not intending to challenge the everywheres. Instead, it seems more likely that these reactionary moves back to the second wave of modernity is due to a crisis of the third wave of modernity. As Leo Strauss says in the end of his essay, the first wave of modernity introduced liberal democracy, the second wave of modernity produced communism, and the third wave gave birth to fascism. Quote, "Yet this undeniable fact does not permit us to return to the earlier form of modern thought. The critique of modern rationalism on the modern belief in reason by Nietzsche cannot be dismissed or forgotten. This is the deepest reason for the crisis of liberal democracy," end quote. Perhaps the anywheres and the somewheres are trying to escape the crisis of the West by returning to the second wave of modernity, but doing so without producing an argument to reject Nietzsche's undermining of that thought. If so, this will not be successful. While I have argued that the everywheres allow us a way to overcome the dichotomy of the somewheres and the anywheres, we have not yet produced an investigation that if the everywheres have a response to Nietzsche's critique. Indeed, such a response is necessary if the everywheres are to produce a coherent political project, as we see how the questioning and doubting of modern science, reason, human equality, individual liberty, and other core ideas of the everywhere is alive and well with us in the contemporary moment. The emergence of the somewheres and the anywheres is only further evidence that the crisis of the West continues. If the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the everywheres are to fully prove to the somewheres and the anywheres that they are incorrect, then the everywheres will also need to develop a thoughtful, meaningful, and coherent response to the beyond theirs, to those that embrace the third wave of modernity. Thank you.